In SMODE, you can perform compositing on several types of layers. You can, for example, make compositing mixing 2D and 3D layers. Here, I'm in a compo that already has a gradient, which is a 2D layer. I can tell because it has this blue color. If I want to create a 3D layer, then I have several possibilities. I can import a 3D object, but that's covered in another tutorial. For this one, I'll simply create a 3D layer from SMODE's layer menu. I right-click in the element tree and choose a sphere in the 3D layers. My sphere has been created, and now I can manipulate this 3D object a bit. In SMODE, you can access two different types of views. The 2D view, which generally corresponds more or less to the final rendering, and the 3D view, which helps place elements in the 3D space of the composition. To access the 3D view, I use this button here on top of the viewport. So here I'm in the 3D view, where I can see all the layers rendered in 3D in my compositing. If I need more precision with the placement of my 3D objects, I can double-click in this view to access the 4-view mode. From there, I can choose one view, for example this one, which will help me place my 3D object on the Y or X axis. If I ever want to go back to my free view, I just double-click to select it. To place a 3D object, you can do so manually using the helpers available in the viewport, or more precisely by going to the 3D object placement parameters. Here I have access to the anchor point, position, and orientation parameters. I can use different types of placement to help me in my animation or interactivity. For example, the current type is position orientation. However, when importing 3D objects, I might need to resize them. For this, the position orientation size type provides access to size multipliers. I'll switch back to 2D view now. As a word of advice, in your composition, create a camera. Simply go to the layers, right-click and create a camera. This gives you access to the camera's direct point of view. This is the current camera. I can tell because it has this little red square, which means it's my current camera. If I switch back to the 3D view, I can access my camera's position here. Sometimes, though, you'll want to position your camera visually. If you switch back to 2D mode, remember that you're actually moving the current camera. And so from here, if you hold down Alt and drag the mouse in the view, you can control the orientation of your camera. If you hold down Alt and use the scroll wheel, you can move the camera forwards and backwards. As SMODE's interface can be customized, here is a tip. You can split your viewport in two to access the 3D space on one side and the 2D rendering on the other. So I will do a vertical split, which will divide my viewport in two, and I'll set this one to be the 3D view. Now I can select my camera, and here you see, I can move its point of view. So I'm going to reset my camera's position by right-clicking on the two little arrows next to the parameters. And here I'm going to give it a distance of 3.5. Also, even 2D layers can be rendered in 3D. Here I have a PNG image that I can import into my composition. So you see, the order of the layers is always important. If it's rendered before my sphere, it will appear behind it. If it's rendered after my sphere, it will appear in front. However, my 2D layer is only visible in the 2D view. I don't see it in my 3D space. In order to render it in 3D, select the 2D layer and go to its renderer. And here, change its type. Instead of being single, I'll switch to the mode 3D renderer. And now, as you can see, my image has appeared in the 3D space. Now I can resize my image. I'll use this pitch parameter here to resize it. And here you can see we have placement options. Position orientation size in this case. So now I can move my image forward on the Z axis. I'll just resize it a little. So the 3D rendering is done via the renderer on the image. What I can also do is add another renderer to it. If I use the shortcut Ctrl plus Mash plus A, it creates a new 3D renderer, completely independent of the previous one. I'll then be able to render my image a second time, but in a different place and with a different orientation. As you can see here, if I start moving my camera, I have this parallax effect. I can also render the background in 3D. It's the same as for my image, even if it's a gradient. I'll simply select it, go to its renderer options, and replace the type to 3D renderer. Sometimes, for various reasons, I need not to have a 2D layer rendered in 3D, but rather a plane textured by these gradients, to be able to use, for example, some 3D modifiers, or because I need to use lights, that sort of things. So there is a fairly simple trick. Right-click on the 2D layer, and if I select the 3D renderer type, we have this option, Transform into 3D layer plane. This completely changes my layer type, giving me a texture plane with my gradients.